We are doing a 4-week study on marriage, and we're trying to answer the question, can a couple be happy together until forever? And what that's going to require. When we get married, we bring with us our hopes, our dreams, and our desires before that marriage, and we think, here's what I think my marriage is going to look like over a long period of time. Got some slides you can look at, like for instance, how much money we should make. You come in with those dreams. And then, how much of that money should we save? You know, should we live on one income and bank the other income, or should we make adjustments and live on 20% or 80% of it and save the other 20%? And then after you've made those decisions, you decide whether or not you should rent or own your own home. And then if you decide you want to buy, you have to decide how big of a home you want. And then you just start talking about children. So you just start with one. Well, that's a good way to begin. Yeah. Maybe you'll have two. Or maybe you should get a basketball team of your own. How will the chores be handled? Who's going to take out the trash? Who's going to do the dusting? Who's going to do the vacuuming? And then how are you going to handle conflict? You know, are you going to yell at each other or raise your voices? Or are you going to sit down over coffee and try to talk it out? Well, you come with a list that is shaped by your experiences that you had as a kid, a teenager, as a young adult. And when we dream about our future marriage, it usually organizes itself around our little list of hopes and dreams and desires. Now, when I daydreamed about marriage, I never dreamed about being the perfect person for the one that I was going to marry and how I was going to help fulfill her hopes and dreams and desires. I dreamt about the perfect person that I was going to marry who was going to fulfill my hopes, dreams, and desires. So when I walked into marriage, I brought my list of hopes and dreams and desires, and Jeanette brought her list of hopes, dreams, and desires. And not only did we exchange rings, but we exchanged lists. And I handed mine to her, and she handed hers to mine. And if she didn't begin to fulfill my hopes and dreams and desires, then those things became expectations. And if she didn't meet my expectations, then she owed me a debt. Now, if I didn't meet her hopes and expectations or dreams and desires, and they became expectations on her part, and I didn't meet them, then I owed her a debt. And you know, and once you owe your spouse anything, you have a problem. I want you to follow with me. If I owe Jeanette a debt because I didn't meet her expectations, and then God gets a hold of me and he begins to say, Dave, you got to make love a verb like we talked about last week. And you got to show her that she's a priority in your life. Matter of fact, she is the priority in your life. And so I decide to make love a verb, and I begin to vacuum the living room rug, and I clean the bathroom like she wants it cleaned. She won't necessarily see that as an act of love. She will simply see it as I'm paying her back. But I still owe her a lot more. Let me give you an example. If you borrow $1,000 from me, and a couple months later you come up to me and you say, Dave, you are a wonderful, wonderful guy, and I just want you to have this. Here's $100. I'm not going to go, wow, thanks for thinking about me. I'm going to think in my head, where's the other 900? That's what happens when our dreams and our desires aren't met by our partner. And even when they do try to change, we don't see it in a positive light. We simply see it as they owe me, and they're paying me back, and they still owe me a lot more, so we're never satisfied. Now, truly happy couples, people who are in love, and they are in love until forever, when they are asked, what does your spouse owe you? They will say, they owe me nothing. Our marriage is based on love being a verb. Now, they probably won't say that. It's based on love. And it's seen in mutual submission. The wife will say, he doesn't owe me anything. The husband says, she doesn't owe me anything. He says, I submit to her. She says, I submit to him. It's almost like we're in submission competition with each other. Who can yield to the other? But we don't owe each other anything. You say, well, where does that come from? Well, last week, we looked at John 13:34. And John 13:34 says this, love one another as I have loved you. Now, when Jesus said that to his disciples, he was meeting with them in the upper room at the Last Supper, the night before he was going to die on a cross. And he says to them, I want you to love each other the way I loved you. Now, he could have stopped and he could have said, Matthew, do you remember when I called you? You were a tax collector. You were hated by all the fellow Jews out there. You were an embarrassment to your parents. You were a sellout to Rome. Do you remember what I said to you? And Matthew would nod and say, yeah. You said, follow me. And I did. And then Jesus turns to Peter and says, Peter, do you remember you didn't want Matthew to join the group? He says, yeah. Who wants to be around a tax collector? And Peter, do you remember whose house we went to for dinner that night after I called Matthew? Yeah, it was the worst night of my entire life. A whole bunch of tax collectors gathering together to talk about you. Oh, it was a terrible night. Then he turns to Nathanael and says, Nathanael, do you remember what you thought about me and my brothers and sisters and my mother and my father? How you dissed us? Now, just in case you don't remember that story, when Nathanael was invited to follow Jesus, he found out that Jesus was from Nazareth. And Nathanael said, how could anything good come out of Nazareth? And I can picture Nate going, yeah, I remember. But all you said was follow me, and you never brought it up. You never brought that up. But Jesus could have gone through that whole list and said, guys, that's exactly how I want you to love each other. I want there to be total acceptance. I want you to believe the best. I want you to hold no grudges. I want you to be patient with each other. But his example didn't end that night. Because the very next day, after that final meal, Jesus went out and died on a cross so that people could experience forgiveness of sins, and so that he could pave a way for you and me to have a relationship with God the Father and with him. You know, his disciples never recovered from his death and his resurrection because they realized that Jesus had given his life on their behalf. And that was how they were to love each other. Not just expecting the best, not just believing the best, not just not holding grudges, but also being willing to die for each other. You've heard of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, here's the platinum rule. Treat others like God, through Christ, treats you. Treat others like God, through Christ, treats you. How did God, through Christ, treat us? Well, this morning when we took communion, we read Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 to 8, and I've printed it for you in your outline. By the way, if you're new and you don't know what the outline is, there's a yellow insert in the bulletin. It's the outline. It's there every week. It has a lot of the scriptures that we'll look at right there. But Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 to 8 speaks to every relationship that we have. But we're going to apply it to the relationship of marriage. Philippians 2:3 says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Now that phrase, selfish ambition, is an idea of competitiveness. So there's not to be any competitiveness in the marriage relationship. Like, for instance, say she's telling a story to a group of friends, and you're there listening to the story, and she gets a few of the details wrong. Well, you don't interrupt and correct her. She's just telling a story. She's not trying to deceive anybody with that story. So there's no reason to interject those corrections, because all that does is draw attention to yourself. It also embarrasses her. So there's no competitiveness in the marriage. The second phrase is this: in humility, value others above yourself. Otherwise, in the relationship, you need to see her or him as more important than yourself. You make decisions as if you believe that she or he is more important than yourself. Now, that doesn't mean that that one person is any more has intrinsic value more than you. No. It simply means that you see them at that moment as more important than you. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been someplace where there was somebody that was more important than you? How about a wedding? Who's more important, you or the bride? The bride. Okay? People do not stand in line to greet you at a wedding. They stand in line to put their arms around the bride and give her a hug and give her a kiss and tell her what a beautiful wedding is. Why? Because that day she's more important than you are. Have you ever noticed that at a wedding, when the bride walks in, everybody stands up? But when you walked in, nobody stood up? You know why? She's more important. You're not the focal point. And they respect her at that moment more than they respect you. So in our marriage, we need to decide every day, I will treat you as if you are more important than I am. Now, I guess it was Friday night, 8 o'clock at night, my wife came down. She sat on the couch and she said, let's watch a show together. So we had DVR'd 3 shows, and 2 of them were my shows, and one of them was her show. And I said, which one would you like to watch? And I'm thinking she's going to pick one of mine. And she says, you know I like Chicago Med. And I thought, and then I remember what I was preaching on Sunday. And I said, you know, you can't make her watch your show. You need to, she's more important to you than that show. And I said to her, we can watch Chicago Med. Didn't I? I did. Now, she tried to take, no, we can watch your show. And I kept it going. We watched Chicago Med. That is saying at that moment, you are more important than I am. Now, the question is, what are you going to get in return? And I would tell you, don't worry about that. You just treat her or him as your most valued possession. Now, how do you treat your most valued possession? Well, guys, if you have a very special car, you know exactly how you treat it. When you wash it, you use certain things with it. You don't want to scratch the paint. Then you wax it. You keep it in the garage. You stand back. You admire it. People who stay in love until forever keep doing the same thing with their spouse. Now, I'm not saying you go out and wash her and wax her and put her in the garage and then stand back and admire her, but you got the idea. It's a decision that you make. It is a verb that you do. Love is a verb. It's a lifestyle that you develop. It is making them feel that they are of great value to you. Verse 4 says this, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. Now, personally, I am most interested in the things that interest me. And I have very little interest in things that don't interest me. So left on my own, I will gravitate to the things that I really enjoy. And I'll gravitate to them emotionally. I'll gravitate to them physically. I'll use my money and my time on things that interest me. If what interests my wife doesn't interest me, I will have a problem. So Paul says this, make a decision to express interest in the interest of the person you want to stay in love with. Now, you used to do that when you were dating. Like, for instance, say, guys, you were dating a young woman and she was into cross-country running. You would go get yourself a pair of cross-country sneakers and you would run with her. You hated every minute of it, but you did it because she was cross-country. You wanted to be with her. And guys, you love fishing. And the woman that you were dating didn't like fishing, but guess what? She took up fishing. And then all of a sudden you got married. And the guy said, I'm too tired to run. And the wife said, I hate cleaning fish. And that was it. Bottom line is, you need to take an interest in what interests your spouse. I did not get permission to do this, but I'm going to do it anyhow. My son-in-law is really into guns. He loves guns. He collects guns. He's got a safe full of guns. If we ever have a war, go to his house. Okay? My daughter wasn't into guns, but guess what she's into now? She's into guns, and she's got her own guns. She shoots her gun. They have now interest together. Now, I would say that he has a greater interest in guns than she does, but she has made it her decision to be interested in what he's interested in. So they have something to do together. Now you must sit back and say, do I have any examples except for you and Jeanette and Carrie and Jason? Yeah, you do. And you have a great example, and it's Jesus Christ. Listen to verse 5 through 7. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. I'm going to stop there. So here it is. In all of your relationships, including the relationship of marriage, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ. You say, well, what was his mindset? Well, look at verse 6 to 7. Who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Now, it says in the first verse, he was always God. But he never leveraged who he was for his own advantage. There was no selfish ambition on his part. There was no competitiveness on his part. He never said to the guys, hey guys, move over, I want that seat. Oh, come on, Jesus, you had that seat last week. Hey, I'm God. If you don't move, I'll move you. You know, there was none of that on his part. But we tend to do that all the time in our relationships. People will say marriage is a 50-50 proposition. It really isn't. It's 100-100, okay? But we'll say it's a 50-50 proposition. So if I get my way 50% of the time, then you can have your way 50% of the time. So if we go to my parents' house on Thanksgiving, then we got to go to your parents' house on Christmas. And if we don't do it that way, then we're going to be upset with each other. Jesus never did that. He also emptied himself, which means he didn't demand what was rightfully his. He didn't demand respect. He didn't demand that his glory be seen. He didn't sell tickets to healing conventions to line his pockets. He emptied himself. He wasn't full of himself. He emptied himself and he became a servant. I want you to think of this. This is God in human form is now coming as a servant, and he says, I have come to serve, not to be served. And he's our example. And verse 8 says, and he was found in the appearance of man, he humbled himself. How do you humble God? Nobody can humble God. So the only way God could be humbled is if God humbled himself. So he humbled himself. That's a verb. And he placed himself under authority. And he submitted himself to others. And he subordinated his will. How did he do that? Well, if you took it into marriage, you would say by coming home early for dinner. No. Or by paying attention to the conversation. No. By staying on budget to cause less friction. No. By picking up the kids after school without being asked? No. Verse 8 says, he did this, he humbled himself by becoming obedient unto death. So Jesus had a dilemma. He could maintain his right to stay in heaven, where he was always right, where he made no mistakes, where he was respected all the time, where his glory shone all around him, where he was worshipped day and night. He could have said, I'm staying put. But the dilemma was he wanted to have a relationship with humanity. And in order to have a relationship with humanity, he had to drop into our world. So that required him to give up what was his due. He gave up his rights. He gave up his respect. He gave up his glory shining around him as the Son of God. But he knew he couldn't have it both ways. So he says, I chose to empty myself. I chose to humble myself. I chose to think of people above myself. I, the Creator, will submit myself to the creature in order to pay for their sins, to pave a way for them to have a relationship with me. And so I will give up everything that is due me. I can't have it both ways. That was Jesus' decision. And he chose to give it up. When it comes to our special relationship, a relationship with our husband, with our wife, or with our fiance. If you want it to be all that it was meant to be, from now until forever, part of you is going to have to die. You can spend the rest of your life being right, making a point, winning all the arguments, and having it always your way. But you will not be in love at the end of the process. You must die. Part of yourself must die. Man, let me ask you a question. What is life to you? What are the priorities in your life? You may say, well, it's my job. Well, it's hunting. It's fishing. It's NASCAR racing. It's football on Sunday afternoons. Well, whatever life is to you, you need to put your wife before that. Now, I didn't say you had to give it up. Okay? But your wife must become your life. But men, you're not going to be able to do that if you have a list of expectations that stand between you and your wife. If you sit back and you're thinking, she doesn't meet my expectations, why should I put her ahead of me? She owes me. You can't do what Christ wants you to do if you feel that she owes you. Now, women, you will not be able to submit to your husband if you have a list of expectations sitting between you and him. If you sit back and say, he doesn't care about my desires and my hopes, why should I care about him? So you ask the question, how do you remove the box of expectations? By making a decision. She doesn't owe me anything. Now, I'm not telling you to get rid of your hopes and your dreams and your desires. I'm just telling you to sit back and say, okay, he doesn't owe me anything. She doesn't owe me anything. And the only possible way that we're going to handle these things is through mutual submission to each other out of reverence for Christ. I have a homework assignment for those of you who did last week's homework assignment. Remember, last week's homework assignment was to make a list of things that you do that you believe let your wife or let your husband or let your fiance or let your significant other know that you love them. They're action things that you do. Now, you weren't supposed to talk about them. You were just simply to write them down on a piece of paper so that you would know what you're doing that is trying to make her or him know that you love them. Now, this week, your homework assignment, I tried to write it on your piece of paper the nicest way I could. I want you to go home, men, and ask your spouse sometime this week. Now, not Saturday night at 9 o'clock at night, okay? Because she's got to ask you the same question. Just go home and ask your spouse, what is on their list of hopes, dreams, and desires? And then stop talking and listen. Don't interrupt. Don't try to ask for explanations. Let your wife tell you the things that are on her hopes and dreams and desires for this relationship that you have. Women, after you've had the opportunity to do that, maybe another night or maybe the same night, You ask your man what is on his list. He will say this: nothing. And he'll get up and leave. That is a lie. You need to stay with him, and you need to help him, let him figure out what it is that's on his list, because he has a list, okay? And when he starts talking, you shut up, and you just take your little pen and you write down his list. When you have finally heard each other's list, you need to look at each other and say, we're going to take Pastor Dave's sermon and put it into practice right now. You don't owe me anything. You don't owe me anything. But once you've heard that, men, you need to go back and take a look at the list of things that she has said she has hopes for, desires or dreams for. Look at that list and pick out something that you haven't been doing that you're going to work on. Why? Because she's number one priority in your life. And women, do the same thing. Find something that you're not working on, that it's his list, and do it because you've made him the priority in your life. Do not go and try to do all 10 things the first week. You can't do it. And you will find some of the things on that hopes, dreams, and desires list that you will never be able to fulfill. And we're going to talk about them next week and how to handle those things. So please do this. This is a way that you make love a verb. By doing what you know you need to do, so that you can have love that will last until forever. Let's unite our hearts together in prayer. Lord, you're fully capable of helping us not just fall in love, but to stay in love until forever. May this week, may we take the time to find out what our special someone has on their list of hopes and dreams and desires. And may we make a personal commitment to striving to meet at least one of those hopes and dreams and desires starting this week. And may we make every effort to make love a verb. There's nothing more we want than to be able to say at the end of our life that we were in love with our spouse till forever. Help us to be able to say that in Christ's name. Amen.